Conrad was already up before the sun, which wasn't unusual. He had been waking before dawn for the better part of 30 years, long before prepping became something people joked about on television, long before anyone outside of a tight circle of like-minded people even used that word seriously. He was a farmer first, and farmers didn't sleep in. The animals needed feeding. The fences needed checking, and there was always something demanding attention before the day got away from him. June had learned early in their marriage that if she wanted to talk to him in the morning, she had better be willing to do it while walking, because Conrad didn't stand still until work was done. That Tuesday in October started the same as every other. He pulled on his boots at the kitchen table while June made coffee. The radio on the counter tuned to the local AM station that ran farm reports and weather at 5 in the morning. The sky outside the window was still black, the kind of deep rural black that city people never really understood, and the temperature had dropped overnight enough that his breath fogged when he stepped onto the porch to check the animal shelters. He could hear the cattle moving in the far shelter, low and restless the way they sometimes got before weather change, and he made a mental note to check the barometer before heading out to the east fence. There was a section of post that had been leaning for 2 weeks, and he had been meaning to reset it before the ground hardened any further. He had no idea that fence post was going to be the least of his concerns before the morning was over. The radio was mid-sentence on a corn futures report when it cut out. Not static, not a slow fade, just a clean, hard cut to silence. The kind that made Conrad stop with his coffee halfway to his mouth and hold it there. He stood still for a second, waiting for it to come back, and when it didn't, he walked to the counter and turned the dial to the next station. Nothing. He turned it again. Nothing on that one either. He kept going until he found a signal 3 clicks over, a larger regional station out of Knoxville that had better equipment and a stronger tower, and what he heard made him set the coffee mug down very carefully on the counter, like he was afraid of breaking something. The broadcaster's voice was tight in a way that professional radio voices were specifically trained never to be, cracking at the edges of words it was trying to deliver with authority. And the words coming out of that speaker were words Conrad had read about, researched, studied, and quietly dreaded for the better part of 2 decades. Yellowstone. Significant seismic event. Eruption confirmed. Ash cloud moving east-northeast at speed. Government agencies urging people in affected zones to shelter in place. The broadcaster kept talking, but Conrad had already stopped listening with his ears and started listening with a part of his brain that he had spent 20 years building and sharpening and hoping he would never truly need. He walked to the back door, opened it, and looked northwest. The sky was still mostly dark, but there was something deeply wrong with the horizon in that direction, a bruised and violent color that had no business being there before sunrise, like a storm that had bypassed every natural warning system and gone straight to the part where the world broke open. He stood on the back porch for no more than 15 seconds. That was all he needed. He went back inside, turned the radio volume up, and took the handheld radio from the charger on the wall beside the refrigerator. June appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her robe, her hair not yet done, reading his face with the fluency that came from 31 years of marriage to a man who wore everything he felt somewhere in the set of his jaw or the stillness of his hands. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't ask if everything was okay. She asked how bad. He told her to get dressed. She was back in the kitchen in 4 minutes flat, fully dressed, boots on, hair pulled back. And that was the thing about June that Conrad had never once taken for granted in all their years together. She didn't waste time on panic. She had sat through every drill, studied every binder in the emergency cabinet, argued with him about supply rotations and generator maintenance and water filtration until she knew the systems as well as he did. She was not a woman who needed to be managed in a crisis, and he thanked God for that as he keyed the handheld. Dillon answered on the first call, his voice carrying the light grogginess of someone who had been asleep an hour ago but woke up clean and fast the way people did when they had been trained to. Conrad gave him the short version in under a minute, and Dillon said he was moving before Conrad finished the sentence. Beckett took 3 attempts before he picked up, his voice thick with sleep and confusion, and Conrad waited exactly long enough for him to get his bearings before saying the word Yellowstone. The line went quiet for just a beat, the kind of quiet that meant something was landing correctly, and then Beckett said he was on his way. Paige had already been awake. She had caught the emergency alert on her phone several minutes before Conrad called and was standing on the porch of her small house on the south end of the property looking northwest when the call came through. She told him she could already see the color change on the horizon from where she was standing, that the sky looked wrong in a way she didn't have words for, and asked what he needed her to do first. He told her to get to the main house and bring her go bag. All 3 of them came through the front door within 15 minutes of the first call, which was 4 minutes faster than their best drill time. Conrad registered that fact without commenting on it. The plan activated the way a plan was supposed to activate when the people following it had actually taken the time to learn it, to practice it, to argue about the details until every step was muscle memory. Dillon went straight to the livestock without being asked, moving the cattle into the reinforced shelter and dropping the heavy crossbar on the outside latch. Beckett pulled both trucks and the tractor into the main barn and ran the fuel transfer lines to the underground reserve tanks beneath the barn floor in a sealed concrete vault Conrad had poured himself 8 years ago. Paige helped June take inventory of the cold storage and cross-reference against the master supply list in the emergency cabinet. Conrad walked the fence line from the northwest corner to the southeast corner, checking every latch, every sensor wire, every camera mount, every gate lock. He tested the manual release on the main gate that bypassed the electronic mechanism, because if the power situation got complicated, he needed to know that gate would open and close on iron alone. He walked the tree line on the north side and looked into the woods for a long time, listening to the silence that had replaced the normal sounds of a rural Tennessee morning. No birds. That was the first thing he noticed. No birds at all. The ash started coming down at 11:47 in the morning. Conrad was at the east fence resetting that leaning post, the one he had been putting off for 2 weeks, working with a kind of focused deliberateness that had nothing to do with the post and everything to do with needing his hands to be doing something useful while his mind processed the scale of what was happening. The first ash came down light, more like a gray powder than anything solid, settling on his coat sleeve in a fine, even layer that didn't brush away the way dust did. He stopped working and held his arm up and looked at it. He looked up at the sky, which had been shifting and darkening since before dawn, and watched the ash falling through completely still air with a patience that felt almost intentional, like the sky was taking its time making a point. There was no wind at all. That was a detail that sat wrong in the back of his mind in a way he couldn't fully explain even to himself. Ash falling in absolute still air, coating the fields and the fence posts and the bare November trees in a layer of gray that erased the color from everything it touched, the light coming down flat and dim and getting worse by the hour. He reset the post anyway, finished the job. Then he walked back to the main house with ash settling on his shoulders and called the family to the kitchen table. He laid out the next 72 hours the way he had rehearsed it more times than he could count, working to the checklist point by point without rushing, his voice level and steady, because he understood that how he sounded in this room right now would set the tone for everything that came after. Reduced power immediately, underground grow operation to full cycle, water filtration running continuous, radio monitoring on the hour. Nobody left the property without a 2-person minimum and a hard return window. June had made soup from the root cellar stores while he talked, and they sat together at the kitchen table and ate while ash ticked softly against the window glass, and the world outside went gray and quiet in a way that felt less like weather and more like a verdict. Nobody said much. Dillon ate with his elbows on the table and his eyes on the window. Beckett kept checking his phone out of habit, even though the signal had been gone since mid-morning. Paige sat next to her mother, and at one point reached over and put her hand on June's without saying anything, and June turned her hand over and held it. Conrad watched his family at that table and felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean name for, some compound of grief and love and iron resolve that settled in his chest and stayed there. That night, he stood at the living room window long after everyone else had gone to bed. The porch light caught the falling ash and turned it into something that might have looked almost peaceful if you could forget what it meant. The fields he had farmed for 22 years were disappearing under a gray blanket that was going to keep getting deeper. The fence posts were shrinking. The tree line had gone soft and indistinct, the individual trees losing their edges and becoming a single gray mass at the edge of the property. The sky had no stars and no moon and no color at all, just a flat, dark ceiling pressing down on the land like the world had been sealed shut. He thought about his neighbors, the ones who had laughed at the fencing and the grow lights and the seed vault over the years, the ones who had called him paranoid at the feed store and smiled about it to each other. He thought about the town 12 miles down the road and tried to picture what it looked like tonight, whether there was any kind of order or whether it had already come apart. He thought about June standing beside him through all of it, every year of preparation, every dollar spent, every raised eyebrow from people who thought he was wasting his life getting ready for something that was never going to happen. He turned off the porch light and stood in the total dark watching the ash fall. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't feel any satisfaction at having been right. He felt the specific and enormous weight of a man who had spent his whole adult life hoping he was wrong about something, standing in the dark with proof that he wasn't, knowing that everything he had built and stored and planned and practiced was the only reason the people sleeping in the rooms behind him were going to be alive in the morning. 6 months was both a long time and no time at all, depending on which part of your brain you asked. The rational part, the part that tracked inventory and monitored the grow lights and logged the water filtration output every morning in the notebook Conrad kept on the shelf above the utility sink, said 6 months was a measurable stretch of survival with data points and progress and a system that was holding. The other part, the part that remembered what green looked like and what the sky was supposed to sound like in the morning when the birds were in the trees and the sun was coming up clean and orange over the east ridge, said 6 months was an eternity inside a gray world that showed no sign of ending. The ash had not stopped falling. It had slowed from the heavy early weeks when it came down thick enough to accumulate several inches overnight and had settled into a steady low fall that added a thin new layer every day, patient and relentless, like the sky had made a decision and intended to see it through. The fields were buried under nearly 3 feet of it now. The fence posts had been swallowed to the cross rails on the low side of the north pasture. The trees at the property edge were gray sculptures of themselves, their branches bent under the weight of accumulated ash that never fully dried because the temperature hovered in a zone that kept everything slightly damp and cold without ever committing to a proper freeze. The grow lights underground were the heartbeat of everything. Conrad had designed the system over 7 years, expanding it twice when he found better components, and revised his calculations on what the family would actually need to sustain through a long-term surface agriculture failure. 3 growing chambers beneath the main barn, each one running a staggered cycle, so there was always something at harvest stage while the next rotation was in growth and the one after that was in early germination. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, carrots, beans, kale, spinach, onions, and a rotation of grains in the largest chamber that required the most attention but produced the most caloric return. The seed vault held enough variety to run the system for 11 years before repetition became a problem. Conrad checked the chambers every morning before breakfast, which had become a ritual that grounded him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Walking down the stairs into the warm lit space beneath the barn, smelling the soil and the growth and the clean, humid air of something alive and productive while the dead gray world sat overhead, was the closest thing to hope he had found in 6 months. The livestock had adapted better than he expected. The cattle were down to 4 head from the original 7, a decision Conrad had made at the 8-week mark when it became clear that the feed situation required hard math. He had done it himself, early in the morning before anyone else was up, and had processed the meat and moved it to cold storage without ceremony. Dillon had figured out the same day and hadn't said anything about it except to help Conrad update the inventory numbers. The chickens were producing well under the supplemental lighting Conrad had rigged in their enclosed shelter, and the eggs had become a cornerstone of the daily nutrition plan. The pigs were most manageable, eating kitchen waste and grain supplement, and Conrad had been rotating them carefully to maintain breeding stock, while keeping the processed weight in cold storage at a level that gave him comfort when he ran the numbers. The numbers were the thing he lived inside of now. Every morning before the grow chamber check, he sat at the kitchen table with the inventory binder and ran the consumption figures against the storage totals and updated the projection sheet that told him how many days of each category remained at current usage rates. 6 months in, the numbers were still good. Not comfortable, but good. There was a difference. Comfortable meant you stopped paying attention, and Conrad had not stopped paying attention for a single day since the ash started falling. The family was a different kind of math, one that didn't fit as neatly into a binder. Dillon was holding up the way Conrad had always expected Dillon would, with a focused, pragmatic energy that channeled itself into work and maintenance, and the kind of daily problem-solving that kept the property like this running. He was the most like Conrad in temperament, methodical and physical, happiest when there was a task in front of him that had a clear completion point. He had taken over the morning livestock check without being asked and had started keeping his own maintenance log for the equipment in the barn, a habit Conrad respected without commenting on because Dillon didn't respond well to praise and both of them knew it. Paige was managing in a way that Conrad watched carefully, and with measured concern, he kept mostly to himself. She was organized and capable and never failed to carry her weight, but she had started asking about outside contact more frequently over the past few weeks, whether there was any signal on any band, whether any of the long-range frequencies had picked up anything that suggested organized communication somewhere out there. Conrad understood the impulse. Paige had always been the most connected of the 3 kids, the most attuned to the larger world, the most likely to feel the walls closing in when the larger world went silent. He gave her honest answers when he had them and redirected her toward tasks when he didn't, which was most of the time, because the honest answer was that the radio had been producing nothing useful for 4 months, and whatever was happening beyond their property line was happening without them. Beckett was the one Conrad lay awake thinking about at night. His middle son had always been the most emotionally complex of the 3, the one who processed things inward and sideways rather than straight through, and 6 months of gray sky and shrinking horizons had pushed something in Beckett to a place that Conrad recognized as fragile, without knowing exactly how fragile. He wasn't failing to function. He did his work, ate his meals, took his watch shifts without complaint. But there was a flatness to him that had been deepening since about the 3rd month, a kind of muted quality in his eyes and his voice that June had named before Conrad did, pulling him aside one evening after dinner and telling him quietly that she was worried about their son in a way that went beyond the situation they were all in. Conrad had started finding reasons to work alongside Beckett, not saying anything therapeutic, just being present and physical and treating his son like a man who was needed, which he was. He made sure Beckett was involved in decisions that mattered, consulted on equipment, asked for his read on the livestock numbers. Not because Conrad always needed the input, though sometimes he did, but because a man who felt useful was a man who had a reason to keep going, and Conrad understood that truth at a level that had nothing to do with prepping and everything to do with being a father. Whether any of it was reaching Beckett in the place it needed to reach him was hard to measure, but Conrad kept doing it because the alternative was to do nothing, and that was not something he knew how to choose. June was the axis. That was the only word Conrad had for it. She ran the household inventory, managed the meal planning, maintained the medical kit and the sanitation protocols, and did it all with a steadiness that Conrad suspected cost her more than she let on. He caught her sometimes in the early evenings sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, just sitting, not reading or writing or doing anything, just sitting in the quiet with an expression on her face that he recognized as grief for a world that was gone and wasn't coming back. He never interrupted those moments. He just made sure she knew he saw them. The first supply run happened at the 5-month mark. Conrad had been planning it for weeks, mapping the route to the nearest town, calculating the risk against a potential gain, running the security protocol with Dillon until they both had it locked. They went out together before dawn in the truck with the filtration masks and the long guns, and came back 4 hours later with less than Conrad had hoped for and considerably more information than he wanted. The drive out had told him as much as the town itself. The roads choked with abandoned vehicles half buried in ash, a burned-out gas station at the county line still smoldering in a way that suggested it had gone up recently, the silence between buildings so complete it had a physical weight to it. The town was not organized. What was left of it was divided into pockets, some of them defensive and some of them desperate. The roads between those pockets were not safe in ways that were hard to fully describe when he sat down with the family that evening and gave his report. They had not been engaged directly. They had been seen twice, and both times had chosen distance over interaction and gotten back to the truck without an incident. But what Conrad had seen in those 4 hours had recalibrated something in his thinking about the outside world and how close it was getting to their gate. He didn't share all of that with the family. He shared enough to keep them alert without tipping them into the kind of fear that made people make bad decisions. There was a line between informed and overwhelmed, and Conrad had been walking it carefully since day one. 2 days after the supply run, Conrad walked the fence line at first light the way he did every morning, working the north side first, because the tree line was closest there, and the tree line was where his instincts had been pointing him with increasing frequency for reasons he hadn't been able to fully articulate even to himself. The ash on the ground along the north fence was undisturbed for the first 100 yards. Then it wasn't. He stopped walking and crouched down and looked at the impressions in the gray surface without touching them. Boot tracks. 2 sets, possibly 3, spaced with a deliberate even stride of people who were not wandering or stumbling, but moving with a purpose and a direction. They ran parallel to the fence line for at least 60 yards, and then turned and went back into the tree line the way they had come. The impressions were crisp at the edges, which meant they were recent, hours at most. Conrad stayed crouched over those tracks for a long time, long enough that the cold worked through his coat and into his knees, the cold gray air sitting on him, the ash still falling in its patient, endless way, and he felt the thing he'd been keeping carefully managed for a 6-month shift under him like the ground had moved. He stood up slowly and looked at the tree line for a long time without seeing anything move. Then he turned and walked back to the main house at a steady pace, not running. Because running told your body something your mind wasn't ready to confirm yet, and Conrad's mind needed a few more minutes before it was ready to say out loud what those tracks meant, what they confirmed, what they made inevitable. Conrad didn't tell anyone about the tracks. He came back to the main house, hung his coat on the peg by the door, washed his hands at the utility sink, and sat down at breakfast with June and said nothing. That wasn't a decision he made consciously so much as one that made itself while he was walking back from the fence line, turning the information over, measuring what he knew against what he didn't, and arriving at the conclusion that telling the family right now would cost him something he wasn't ready to spend. Telling them meant questions he couldn't fully answer yet. It meant a spike of fear and alertness that he couldn't channel into anything productive until he had more information. It meant Beckett, who was already running on thin wire, taking on a new weight before Conrad had a plan to hand him alongside it. So he sat down and ate his eggs and listened to June talk about the grow chamber rotation schedule and watched Dillon work through a second cup of coffee across the table and said nothing about the boot tracks in the ash along the north fence. He gave himself 24 hours. In those 24 hours, he moved quietly and deliberately through a set of preparations that he framed as routine maintenance to anyone who asked. He pulled the spare camera unit from the storage room and mounted it on the north fence post at the tree line end, angled to cover the longest sight line he could get along that stretch of fence. He tested the sensor wire along the north and west perimeter and replaced 2 sections that had developed resistance issues he had been putting off, resetting the tension and burying the new wire under a fresh layer of ash so it was invisible from outside the fence. He checked the battery banks on the alarm panel in the utility room and swapped the 2 cells that were showing reduced output. He moved the 2 spare long guns from the main house gun cabinet to the barn, wrapped and secured in a position he could reach in under a minute from the livestock area, and he restocked the ammunition storage in the hidden compartment beneath the kitchen floorboards without saying what he was doing or why. He was thorough and unhurried, and he did not look like a man preparing for something. He looked like a man doing maintenance, which was what he always looked like, which was exactly the point. Dillon found him on the second evening. Conrad was in the barn doing a final check on the camera feed when he heard his son come through the side door and cross the floor without being called, which meant Dillon had been watching him and had waited until he had something specific to bring. Dillon stopped beside him and looked at the camera monitor for a moment without speaking, taking in the angle, the coverage, the fact that it was new and pointed at the north fence in a way that the existing cameras were not. Then he looked at his father and waited. Conrad told him about the tracks, all of it straight and without softening it, because Dillon was the one person on this property he could not afford to keep it partial information. He watched his son's face process it, the jaw tightening, the eyes going to monitor and then back to Conrad, and then Dillon asked 2 questions. How many sets of tracks and how fresh? Conrad told him 2 sets minimum, possibly 3, and fresh enough to have been made the same morning he found them. Dillon nodded once and asked what he needed him to do. Conrad told him. They worked out the watch rotation between the 2 of them standing in the barn, a 2-person night schedule that covered the blind spots in the existing camera system, alternating in 4-hour blocks that started that night. Conrad took the first watch himself. He sat in the dark utility room with a monitor bank in front of him and watched the north fence line for 4 hours while the rest of the property slept and the ash fell in its slow, patient way outside every window. Nothing moved. The tree line was still and gray and gave nothing away. He sat through the full 4 hours without leaving the chair except once to refill his coffee, keeping his eyes on the feed with particular quality of attention that he'd learned over decades of farming, and that was different from simple watchfulness. It was the ability to look at something without mentally narrating it, to let the eye take in the full frame without the brain jumping ahead to conclusions, to notice a thing that was wrong before you could name what the wrong thing was. For hours of that kind of looking produced nothing. The tree line did not move. Whatever had made those tracks was not moving at night, which was either reassuring or the opposite depending on how you thought about it. And Conrad had spent enough time thinking about it by the end of his watch that he had arrived somewhere close to the opposite. On the 3rd morning, Beckett came to the main house before breakfast and found Conrad alone in the kitchen and told him he knew something was going on. He wasn't angry about it. He said it the way a man said something he had already decided not to make a fight of, straightforwardly and without heat, standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his eyes steady. Conrad looked at his son for a moment and then pulled out the chair across from him and told him to sit down. He gave Beckett the same information he had given Dillon, watching the way he always watched Beckett for the signs of the inward spiral, the retreat behind the eyes. It didn't happen. Something else happened instead. Something Conrad hadn't fully anticipated. Beckett sat up straighter. The flatness that had been sitting over him for months shifted, and something sharper came up underneath it. A focus that Conrad recognized as a thing that had always been there in his son, but that needed a clear and specific threat to fully surface. Beckett asked good questions, practical ones, about the camera coverage and the alarm system and the defensive positions on the property. Conrad answered all of them and found himself thinking that he'd been worried about the wrong version of Beckett, or at least that the version he'd been worried about had a different relationship with fear than Conrad had assumed. He told Dillon about the conversation that afternoon, and Dillon said he wasn't surprised, which Conrad noted without comment. He thought about that for a while after, about how well you could know your own children and still miss the shape of them under pressure, still carry a version of them in your head that belonged to an earlier year, and fail to account for who they had become in the years since. He had not yet told June or Paige. June he would tell that evening. Paige he was still calculating. On the fourth day after finding the tracks, he saw the figure. He was at the kitchen window in the early afternoon, standing with a cup of coffee, watching the north fence line the way he had taken to doing whenever he was inside and near a window, and the figure was just there at the tree line, standing between two ash-coated trunks at a distance that made detail impossible through the gray air. It wasn't moving. It was just standing in the gap between the trees, in a posture that conveyed a complete and unhurried stillness that was somehow more alarming than movement would have been. Conrad set the coffee down without looking away from the window and watched the figure for 60 seconds. It did not move. He went to utility room and pulled up the north camera feed and found the figure in the frame, still stationary, still just standing at the tree line looking at the property. He could not make out a face or specific gear of the camera's resolution, but he could see the shape was adult male, upright, and had something across his back that was almost certainly a long gun. He keyed the handheld and raised Dillon in a low voice and told him to come to the utility room. By the time Dillon got there, the figure was gone. The tree line was empty and still and gave no indication that anyone had ever been standing in it. And if Conrad hadn't watched it happen himself, he might have been able to persuade himself he had seen a shadow or a broken branch. He did not persuade himself of that. He told Dillon what he had seen, and Dillon stood at the monitor for a long time without speaking, and then said they needed to go out and look. Conrad had already decided the same thing. They went out together the next morning before dawn, moving along the inside of the fence line to the north corner, and then through the gate with their rifles up and their filtration masks on, crossing the open ground between the fence and the tree line in quick, deliberate movements, and then slowing when they entered the tree cover. The ash on the ground in the woods was disturbed in a wide area, multiple sets of tracks overlapping, a clear indication that more than two people had been moving through the stretch of tree line over recent days. They followed the most defined track line deeper into the woods for about 200 yards before Conrad stopped and held up a fist, and they both went still. Ahead of them was a coal camp, a cleared area between four large trees. The ash scraped back from a central fire pit that had been built with a knowing hand, the kind of fire structure that burned hot and low and through minimal visible smoke. The pit was cold, the ash inside it gray and undisturbed, but around it were the unmistakable signs of recent occupation. Flattened ground where sleeping positions had been laid out, a piece of cordage tied between two trees at head height, 10 markings on the bark of one tree that could have been a map notation, scattered boot impressions that Conrad counted before he stopped counting, because the number was higher than he wanted it to be. He crouched at the fire pit and held his hand 2 inches above the ash and felt nothing, no residual warmth at all. This camp had been cold for at least a full day, maybe 2, which meant whoever had been using it had moved on or moved somewhere else, or were simply not here right now, which was a different thing entirely from being gone. He stood and looked at Dillon and saw his son reading the camp the same way he was, arriving at the same numbers. They didn't speak. They moved back through the tree line to the fence, through the gate, and back to the main house at a pace that was controlled and quiet, and said everything that needed saying, without either of them having to say it out loud. Conrad pulled the gate shut behind them, and threw the latch and stood for a moment with his hand on the cold iron of it, looking back at the tree line. Then he turned and walked the house and opened the back door and stepped into the kitchen and stopped. Voss was sitting at his kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface and a look on his face like a man who had been waiting a reasonable amount of time and would prepare to wait a reasonable amount more. Conrad stood in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds. That was all the time he allowed himself before he moved, stepping into the kitchen and letting the door close behind him with a deliberate quiet that he hoped communicated something to the man at the table, without giving away everything he was feeling underneath it. What he was feeling was a cold and focused rage that he had no intention of letting anywhere near his face. He set his rifle against the wall beside the door in a motion that was slow and visible, not because he was surrendering it, but because he wanted Voss to see that he was capable of calm, that he was not a man who was going to make a panicked or reckless decision, and that putting the gun down was a choice and not a necessity. He crossed the kitchen and pulled out the chair across from Voss, and sat down and looked at the man. Voss was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean in the way that people got lean when calories were a calculation rather than an assumption, with a weathered face that had the particular quality of someone who had been outside in all weather for a long time and had stopped noticing it. His hands were flat on the table, as they had been when Conrad came in, and they stayed there, which Conrad read as a deliberate signal of non-aggression that he accepted without trusting. There was a quality to Voss's stillness that was not relaxed. It was a stillness of something coiled, held in a controlled and practiced state of readiness that looked like calm the way a drawn bow looked like it was just holding still. His eyes were pale and steady, and took Conrad in with an inventory efficiency that Conrad recognized because he did the same thing himself when he entered an unfamiliar situation. They were the eyes of someone who assessed first and committed second, which made him more dangerous than a man who simply acted, and Conrad understood that within the first 30 seconds of sitting across from him. Dillon was not in the house. Conrad had come in ahead of him, which meant Dillon was still outside and either didn't know Voss was here or had seen something that kept him outside. Conrad filed that away without letting it show and kept his attention entirely on the man across the table. June was not in the kitchen either. The house had a particular quality of emptiness that meant she was in the back rooms, and he sent a quiet and wordless instruction toward that emptiness that he knew June would never receive, but that he issued anyway. The way you issued things that could not be transmitted, because the act of forming them steadied something inside him. Voss spoke first. His voice was even and unhurried, a measured baritone with a flatness to it that suggested he had trained expressiveness out of it the way you train other things out, by repetition and intention over a long period of time. He said he appreciated Conrad's hospitality and that he hoped the entry through the back had not been too alarming, that he had knocked but no one had answered, and he had let himself in because he wanted the first conversation to happen inside rather than outside, and he thought Conrad would understand the reasoning once they talked. Conrad said nothing. Voss said his name was Voss, that he and his men were former military, that they had been moving through the region for several weeks and had identified Conrad's property as one of the few genuinely operational setups they had encountered in a significant radius. He said this with what sounded like genuine respect, the tone of one professional acknowledging the work of another, and Conrad noticed that and did not let it do anything to him. Voss said they were not looking for a conflict. He said they had supplies of their own, limited but sufficient for mobility, and that what they needed was specific and temporary. Medical supplies primarily, and a resupply of certain nutritional staples that their mobile setup could not replicate. He named the items with precision that told Conrad he already knew what was in the storage rooms, or had made a very educated guess, which amounted to the same thing. He said they would move on within 48 hours of getting what they needed, and that Conrad would not see them again. He said all of this with his hand still flat on the table, and his pale eyes steady on Conrad's face, and his voice carrying the smooth practiced register of a man who had delivered versions of the speech before and knew which parts needed to land softly and which parts could carry weight. Conrad listened to all of it without interrupting. When Voss finished talking, Conrad sat with a silence for a moment, not because he needed to think about his answer, but because he wanted to look at Voss in quiet and see what the quiet did to him. It did nothing. Voss waited with the same coiled stillness he had come in with, neither pressing nor retreating, just waiting. Conrad asked how many men. Voss said enough. Conrad said that wasn't an answer, and Voss said it was the answer he was prepared to give right now, and that Conrad should consider it an honest one, because it meant the number was neither 0 nor 1, and that the specific figure was less important than the understanding that this conversation was a civil version of a situation that had other versions available to it. Conrad heard that clearly. He let it sit in the room without reacting to it, because reacting to a threat framing was exactly what Voss wanted, a visible shift in posture or tone that told him where Conrad's limit was and how hard he would need to push to reach it. Conrad was not going to give him that. He asked what former military meant, which branch, which unit. Voss smiled for the first time, a small controlled thing that reached nowhere near his eyes, and said that the organizational structures that answer belonged to no longer existed in any functional sense, and that he hoped Conrad would grant him the same latitude he would extend to any man whose credentials had been made irrelevant by circumstances neither of them had chosen. Conrad said he understood. He did not say he believed it. He asked about the 48 hours and whether Voss was prepared to offer anything in exchange for supplies he was requesting, or whether the request was a courtesy framing on what was actually a demand. Voss looked at him for a moment with something that might have been appreciation, and said that Conrad asked the right questions, that yes, there was an exchange available, and that what Voss's group could offer was information, detailed and current information about the region within a 50-mile radius, the locations of other survivor groups, their sizes and dispositions, the road conditions and hazard points, and location of 2 supply caches that had not yet been found by anyone else to his knowledge. He said this information was worth considerably more than medical supplies and nutritional staples, and that he was prepared to provide it in full upon receipt of the requested items. Conrad looked at the man across his kitchen table and thought about the boot tracks along the north fence and the cold camp in the tree line, and the figure standing still between the ash-covered trees watching the property in the middle of the afternoon with the patience of something that had already decided the outcome and was simply managing the timeline. He thought about the 48-hour figure Voss had used, the clean specificity of it, and whether it was a real number or a number chosen because it sounded reasonable and temporary and non-threatening, a number designed to move the conversation past the point where Conrad might say no. He thought about Tuck and Ferris, 2 names he did not yet have, but 2 shapes he had seen through the utility room window in the 60 seconds between sitting down with Voss and the moment his eyes went to the glass. 2 men moving slowly along the outside of the far fence near Dillon's house, not approaching it, just moving along it the way you moved along something you were measuring. He had clocked them in his peripheral vision when he sat down and had not looked directly at them since, because looking directly at them would have told Voss that he had seen them. He had not told Voss that he had seen them. He looked at Voss and said the offer was reasonable and that he would need a few hours to pull together what was being requested, and that Voss was welcome to wait on the porch. Voss said he would prefer to wait inside where it was warm, and Conrad said he understood that preference and that the porch was where Voss would be waiting. There was a beat of silence between them that had an edge to it, a moment where the 2 versions of the situation that Voss had referenced were both present in the room at the same time, and then Voss nodded once and stood up from the table and said that was fine, and that he looked forward to finishing the conversation. Conrad walked him to the back door and watched him step onto the porch and pull the door mostly closed behind him, and then Conrad stood in his own kitchen for 30 seconds doing nothing, except breathing through the specific discipline of not letting what he knew show in his body until he was ready for it to show. He went to the utility room and pulled up the outside cameras. Voss was on the back porch as agreed. On the north side camera, he could see 1 figure at the tree line, stationary. On the camera covering the south fence near Paige's house, he could see 2 more figures moving with the same slow, deliberate pace he had seen on the west side, not approaching, just looking, just learning to lay out the distances, the positions of the structures, the sight lines between them, cataloging everything with a patience that told Conrad this had never been a negotiation. It had been a reconnaissance dressed as a conversation, and while Voss sat in his kitchen talking about medical supplies and 48-hour timelines, his men had been walking the perimeter of everything Conrad had spent 20 years building and taking notes. Conrad stood at the monitor bank and looked at the figures on the screens and felt the specific cold clarity of a man who has just had his last comfortable assumption removed. He counted the visible figures. 1 at the north tree line, 2 on the south fence. He did not have eyes on Voss's full number, and he was not going to get them from the cameras he currently had, which meant the cameras he currently had were not sufficient for what was coming, and he needed to fix that before tonight. He needed to fix a number of things before tonight. He thought about June in the back of the house, and Paige in her home on the south end, and the 2 figures he had just watched move slowly past their fence line. And he felt something move through him that was not fear and not anger, but some compressed combination of both that had nowhere to go yet, and so sat in him like heat with no outlet. He had known something was coming. He had felt it in the boot tracks and the cold camp and the figure at the tree line. But knowing something is coming and watching it position itself around your family are 2 different weights entirely. And the second one settled into Conrad's chest now with a permanence that told him everything about what the next few days were going to require. Conrad brought the family together in the main house an hour after Voss left the porch. He had watched the man walk back to the tree line with the same unhurried stride he had arrived with, disappearing into gray without looking back, and had given it 30 minutes before pulling everyone in because 30 minutes was enough time for Voss to be gone and not enough time for Conrad to lose a specific cold focus that the conversation had put in him and that he needed to still be carrying when he stood in front of his family and told them what was coming. He did not soften it. He laid out everything: the tracks, the camp, the figure at the tree line, the conversation at the kitchen table, the men he had seen on the cameras moving along the fence lines while Voss sat inside playing reasonable. June held his eyes the whole time with an expression that he recognized as the face she wore when she was converting hard information directly into action rather than feeling. Dillon was already in the room knowing most of it and spent the briefing watching his siblings instead of his father. Beckett sat forward with his elbows on his knees and asked 2 questions that were both about defensive positioning, which told Conrad everything he needed to know about where Beckett's head was. Paige was the one he watched most carefully. She was quiet to the whole thing, her jaw set, her eyes moving between Conrad and the window, and when he finished, she asked 1 question. She asked if Voss was going to come back with his full number or send some of them first to see what happened. Conrad said he didn't know and that both were possible and that they were going to prepare for both. That was the right answer to give her because it was the honest one and because Paige, of all his children, had the least tolerance for being managed and the most instinct for when she was being told a comfortable version of something. The next 6 hours were the most productive 6 hours the family had put in since the first days after the eruption. Conrad pulled a defensive plan from the emergency binder, the one he had written and revised over 4 years, and that covered exactly the scenario: a hostile external group with unknown numbers attempting to take the property by force or intimidation. He had never shown the full plan to the family before, had kept in the binder the way you kept certain things in reserve. Not because he doubted them, but because showing it too early would have made the threat feel immediate in a way that would have worked against the daily functioning they needed to maintain. Now the threat was immediate, and the plan came out of the binder and onto the kitchen table, and they went through position by position. The property had 4 primary defensive positions, 1 at each corner of the main structure cluster, each one chosen for its sight lines and its coverage of the approaches from the tree line and the road. Conrad took the northwest position himself, the one with the longest sight line to the tree line, where the camp had been. Dillon took the northeast, which covered the main gate and the road approach. Beckett took the southeast corner, covering the gap between the main barn and Paige's house. Paige pushed back on being assigned the southwest interior position, which was the most protected and the least exposed, and Conrad let her push back for exactly 30 seconds before he told her that the southwest position was not the safe one. It was the most critical one because it controlled the only internal route between all 4 structures, and that if the perimeter broke, she was the last line between whatever came through it and her mother. Paige held his eyes for a moment and then nodded and stopped arguing. June ran the communications and the medical station from the main house interior, which put her at the monitor bank with visibility to all camera feeds and the ability to relay position information to each of the 4 corners via handheld. Conrad had tested the handhelds that afternoon and replaced the batteries in all 4 units and confirmed the channels were clear. They ate together at the kitchen table at 6 in the evening, a full meal, because Conrad insisted on it, because people made worse decisions when they were hungry, and because sitting at the table together and eating something June had made from the root cellar stores was an act of normalcy that cost nothing and was worth more than he could calculate. Nobody talked much. Beckett ate everything on his plate, which Conrad noted. Paige helped June clean up, and they stood at the sink talking in low voices that Conrad did not try to hear. Dillon sat beside Conrad after the meal, and they went over the signal protocol one more time. The handheld code for contact made and contact broken, and the two-tone that meant fall back to the main house immediately. It was fully dark by 8. Not that dark meant much under the ash sky, which produced a flat ambient gray that was neither true dark nor anything close to light, but the temperature dropped further after sunset, and the ash fell with slightly increased density in the colder air, and the property at night had a quality of muffled silence that Conrad had never fully gotten used to in 6 months. He was at the northwest position by 8:15, settled into the covered observation point he had built into the corner of the main barn's exterior wall 3 years ago, a low recessed alcove with a timber brace overhead that broke his outline and gave him a clear forward view of the tree line, while keeping him out of the sight line of anyone approaching from the north or west. He had his rifle, 3 loaded magazines, the handheld on the lowest volume that would still reach him, and a thermos of coffee that June had pressed into his hands as he left the house. The first 2 hours were silence. The tree line did not move. The ash fell. Conrad drank his coffee slowly and kept his breathing measured and did not allow himself to think about outcomes. Only the present moment. At 10:43, the first sensor wire on the north fence triggered. It was a single pulse on the alarm panel that June relayed to all 4 positions via handheld in a low and steady voice that Conrad felt a surge of something fierce and private for, the quality of her under pressure never failing to reach him even in the middle of something like this. He keyed back a single click to confirm receipt and shifted his weight forward and put his eye to the gap in the timber brace and looked at the north fence line. Nothing visible. The ash and the flat gray dark made the fence a soft outline at this distance, and the tree line beyond it was a mass of indistinct shapes that could have been anything or nothing. Then the second sensor triggered, this one on the west fence, and the space in between the 2 triggers was wrong for a single person, too wide, too simultaneous, and Conrad keyed the two-tone alert before he had fully consciously processed why, his hands moving on the decision before his brain had finished making it. Dillon came back with a single click. Beckett came back with a single click. Paige came back with a single click. June's voice on the handheld said south camera was showing movement at the fence line, 2 figures, and Conrad said copy and stay on the feeds and moved out of the alcove into the open ground between the barn and the main house in a low, fast crouch that kept him below the sight line of the north fence. He heard it before he saw it, a sound that should not have existed in the muffled ash silence world of property at night, a metallic contact that was a fence latch on the west gate being worked from the outside. Not forced, worked. Someone who knew what they were doing with a gate latch, which was worse than someone forcing it, because it meant they had studied it. He came around the corner of the main barn at a low run, and the figure was already through the gate and inside the perimeter, and Conrad had less than a second to process the shape and the movement before the figure registered him and swung up, and Conrad dropped to one knee and fired twice. The figure went down hard in the ash and did not move. From the south end of the property, he heard 2 shots in quick succession, Beckett's rifle, and then silence, and then Beckett's voice on a handheld saying contact down, 1 figure, and then a 3rd shot from the east side that was Dillon's, and a burst of movement that Conrad caught in peripheral vision. As a 2nd figure, he had not seen cleared the north fence in a running vault and crossed the open ground toward the main house. Conrad was up and moving before the figure reached the porch steps, cutting the angle, closing the distance, and he came around the corner of the porch at a dead run and hit the figure at full speed in a collision that drove both of them into the porch railing with a force that cracked the timber and sent them both down into the ash. What followed was close and ugly and had nothing to do with tactics, just 2 men in the dark fighting for the same ground. Conrad was 53 years old and felt every year of it, but he was fighting for something that the man underneath him was not, and that difference was the one that mattered. It was over in under 2 minutes. Conrad stood up breathing hard with blood on his face from a gash above his eye and looked down at the figure in the ash, and then looked up at the property around him. The night had gone silent again. He keyed the handheld and called positions one by one and got responses from Dillon and Beckett, and then June's voice saying Paige was with her and they were secure inside, and then June saying a different tone, a tone Conrad had not heard from her in 31 years of marriage, that Beckett was hit. Conrad was through the front door in 20 seconds. Beckett was on the kitchen floor with June beside him applying pressure to his left side with a folded dish towel that was already soaked through, and Beckett's face was pale and tight, but his eyes were open and focused, and when Conrad came to the door, his son looked up at him and said he was okay in a voice that was working harder than it needed to if that were fully true. Conrad crouched beside him and looked at the wound and looked at June, and they exchanged something over Beckett's head that neither of them put into words. Conrad told his son he did good. Then he stood and told Dillon they needed to sweep the perimeter and account for all contacts before anything else, because until they knew how many men had come over that fence tonight, the property was not secure. Dillon nodded, and they went out together into the ash and the gray dark. And it was while they were doing that sweep, walking the fence line in opposite directions to meet in the middle, that Conrad counted the figures and arrived at a number that sat wrong in his chest from the moment he reached it. 3 contacts. 3 men had come over or through his fence tonight. He had counted 4 names in Voss's group, and Voss himself had not been among the 3 who came. Conrad stood in the ash with that arithmetic sitting in him, and understood with certainty that had no room for argument that Voss had not sent his full force tonight. He had sent enough to measure the response, the reaction time, the positions, the number of defenders. They had won nothing tonight. They had shown their hand to a man still sitting in the dark beyond the tree line, and the real confrontation had not yet begun. Conrad did not sleep. He sat in the utility room with a monitor bank and a handheld and the cold arithmetic of what he knew and what he didn't. And he worked the problem away he had worked every hard problem in his life, methodically and without the luxury of panic, breaking it into its components and examining each one until he had a picture that was as complete as the available information allowed. What he knew was this: Voss had sent 3 men over the fence. 1 had come through the west gate with enough knowledge of the latch to work it quietly, which meant he had studied it up close during the days of watching before the kitchen table conversation. 1 had come over the north fence in a running vault. 1 had engaged Beckett on the south end near Paige's house, which Conrad read as a probe of the family's weakest defensive angle. All 3 had been neutralized. None of them was Voss. Tuck, Ferris, Zane, and cope with the names Conrad had assembled for what he had observed and what the camp in the tree line had suggested about group size. 3 were accounted for tonight in the way that ended conversations, that left at minimum 1 more in the tree line with Voss, and Voss himself, and Conrad was not prepared to assume the count stopped there. He sat with that for a long time and then went to check on Beckett. June had the wound cleaned and dressed. A through and through on the left side that had missed anything vital by a margin. Conrad was not going to examine too carefully until after this was over. Beckett was on the couch with his color coming back, and his jaw set in a way that reminded Conrad so sharply of June at certain moments that it stopped him briefly in the doorway. He asked Beckett how he felt, and Beckett said he felt like he'd been shot, which Conrad accepted as a reasonable answer. And then Beckett asked what the plan was, and Conrad told him to rest, and that he would know what he needed to know when he needed to know it, and Beckett looked at him for a moment, and then lay back without arguing, which told Conrad his son was hurting more than he was letting on. Paige was in the kitchen with a cup of tea and a rifle across her knees, an expression that Conrad did not try to talk her out of because it was the right expression for the situation. He sat across from her and told her what had worked out in the utility room, all of it, the count and the gap, and what he believed Voss had learned from a night's engagement. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked how long they had before Voss came back with everything he had left. Conrad said he didn't know, but that Voss would not want to give them time to regroup, and that his best estimate was before the next nightfall. Paige nodded and asked what she could do, and Conrad told her. By the time the flat gray dawn came up over the ash-covered property, Conrad had a plan, and the property had been changed in ways that Voss had not seen and could not have accounted for from the outside. The most important change was underground. The tunnel that ran from a main house basement to the barn had been built 6 years ago and was a single piece of infrastructure on the property that Conrad had never mentioned to anyone outside the family, had never written about in any of the prepper forums he had occasionally visited, had kept with secrecy that June had teased him about, and that he had maintained without apology, because there were things you kept close, and this was one of them. The tunnel was 40 feet long, reinforced with treated timber, and came up to a hatch in the barn floor near the livestock area. It had never been used for anything except storage and the occasional childhood game that his kids had outgrown before he finished building it. Tonight, it was going to be the pivot point of everything. The second change was a grow chamber access hatch in the north end of the barn, which Conrad had rigged with secondary latch that could be thrown from inside and that opened onto a crawl space running beneath the barn's north wall, exiting through a buried and camouflaged panel in the ground 12 feet outside the north fence. He had built it as an emergency exit route in the event the property was ever compromised from the inside and the main gate was blocked. He had never told anyone about it, not even June. He told June and Dillon about it that morning and watched their faces and said nothing else. The final change was to the positioning. Conrad pulled everyone back from the outer defensive corners and consolidated the family in and around the main structure, which surrendered the perimeter but compressed the defensive zone into a tighter and more manageable shape, and, more importantly, put the tunnel and the barn crawl exit into the center of the defensive geometry rather than at the edges of it. He was giving up ground to make the ground. He kept more dangerous. Voss had measured the response times and the firing positions the night before. He knew where the defenders had been standing. He did not know that none of them would be standing there tonight. They ate again at midday, the 5 of them around the kitchen table, and Conrad looked at his family in the flat ash filter light coming through the window and thought about everything that table had held over the years. Arguments and celebrations and the specific ordinary texture of a family eating a meal together in a place they had built and maintained through 20 years of work and intention. He thought about Beckett on the couch and the margin between a wound and something that could not be recovered from. He thought about Voss in the tree line, patient and calculating, with whatever remained of his group and the knowledge he had bought with 3 men the night before. He was still thinking about it when Dillon touched his arm and said the north camera had movement. They moved to their positions with a speed and silence that Conrad registered with a distant and fierce pride even in the middle of what was coming. His family moving to a plan like people who had been built for exactly this, which in a real sense they had been. Voss came at mid-afternoon, which Conrad had not predicted, and which told him something important about Voss's rhythm, that Voss believed daylight favored his numbers, and that the family would be expecting a night approach after the night before. He was not wrong about the first part, and he was wrong about the second, and the gap between those two things was where Conrad had put everything he had. They came from two directions simultaneously, the north tree line and the road approach from the east, moving fast and with a coordination that confirmed military training and a confidence that Conrad read as the confidence of men who believed they had already done the hard intelligence work and knew what they were walking into. They did not know about the tunnel. The north approach came straight at the barn the way Conrad had expected. Drawn by the structure and the sight lines the camp reconnaissance had identified as the primary target, Conrad let them reach the fence. He let them come through it, two figures moving in tight and practiced formation, before Dillon triggered the first distraction from the barn's east window, a concussive noise that served no purpose except to pull attention eastward for 3 seconds. Conrad needed to come up to the tunnel hatch in the barn floor directly behind the two figures who had just entered through the north fence and were crossing the open ground between the fence and the barn. What followed did not take long. The east approach was Voss himself with the one remaining man, coming up the road in the kind of direct and unhesitating line that told Conrad Voss had committed fully and was not holding anything back, which meant Voss believed he had numbers to finish this, and that the east approach was the closer. Paige was on the east approach. Conrad had put her there because she was the best shot on the property, a fact he had never said aloud because it would have made her the obvious choice for every dangerous position. And he was not going to use his daughter as a frontline asset until the situation demanded exactly that. She did not miss. The remaining figure broke east across the road when Paige's first shot dropped Voss's partner, moving fast and low into the ash-covered scrub on the road shoulder, and Dillon came out of the barn's east door and ran him down a gray field beyond the fence before he made the tree line. Conrad found Voss at the east gate. He was not running. He was standing at the gate with his rifle at his side, not raised, held down and loose, and he was looking at Conrad with those pale, steady eyes and the particular expression of a man who has just completed a calculation and arrived at an answer he does not like but can accept. They stood on opposite sides of the gate in the ash-falling afternoon and looked at each other for a moment. Conrad was breathing hard from the tunnel and the barn and everything after it, and Voss was not breathing hard at all, which under different circumstances Conrad might have found impressive. Voss said Conrad had surprised him. Conrad said that was the idea. Voss looked at him for another moment, and then looked past him at the property, the barn, the main house, the structures that were still standing and still intact after everything that had just happened, and something moved across his face that was not quite respect and not quite anything else Conrad had a clean name for. Then Voss set his rifle against the gate post and raised both hands, and Conrad held his own rifle level and steady and told Voss to get on his knees in the ash and wait. And Voss did. The family came out property one by one in the gray afternoon light. Dillon first, and then June helping Beckett, who was upright and moving under his own power and had insisted on being present for this. And finally Paige from the east side with ash on her coat and her rifle at low ready, and an expression on her face that Conrad recognized as the expression of someone who has just discovered something definitive about what they're capable of and is still in the process of deciding how to feel about it. They stood together in front of the gate with the ash falling around them and the gray sky pressing down, and the world outside their fence still gray and broken and giving nothing back. And Conrad looked at what was left of the thing that had come for them and felt the weight of the last 24 hours settle into his body all at once. The sleeplessness and the fear he hadn't let himself feel, and the wound on Beckett's side, and every decision he had made in the dark utility room in the small. Hours trying to find the shape of something he couldn't fully see. He looked at his family standing in the ash and thought about 20 years of being called crazy, 20 years of building something that the world kept telling him he would never need. And he thought about the leaning fence post he had been meaning to fix the morning Yellowstone went off. And he thought that he was very tired and that the cattle needed feeding, and that the grow chamber rotation was due for a check, and that as long as those things were true, the world had not ended completely. And probably wouldn't. Not for his family. Not on this gray and ash-covered piece of Tennessee ground that they had fought for and kept and intended to keep for as long as any of them were standing on it.